Here we're going to assemble and install the landing gear onto the chassis we've put together. For this you'll need the 4 landing gear struts, the 2 skids, 4 M4 by 16 socket heads, 4 M3 by 8 socket heads, the 4 frame doublers, and the 2 frame spacers that have M4 threads in them. You'll also need an M4 hex driver, an M2.5 and an M2 hex driver, blue thread lock, and slow CA. The skids are going to be held into these struts by M4 set screws that are going to thread into the bottom of the struts. You'll need an M2 hex driver, and they thread in. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to turn these until it actually protrudes inside this. You should be able to see that because the holes are very tight. And first you want to let it pass through and then back it out so that the skid is clear again. That way when you go to tighten it up, it'll fit easier. Now if the set screw fits loosely into this, you're going to want to put some slow CA on it when we do the final tighten, but not at this point. Now we're going to install a pair of the struts. We'll start at the back. It doesn't matter if you start at the front or the back. To install these, you'll need the frame doublers, and they're different for the front and the back. The back have this shape, fit like so. The other 2 are for the front and they won't fit here correctly. You'll also need one of the 4mm frame spacers and the 3 and 4mm socket heads. If you look at the end of the skid, or the strut, it has a peg and it has a 4mm hole, and it has a hole through it. The 4mm bolt is going to be threaded through here until it just starts to protrude out of the front or out of the back, and then we're going to set it into the frame with the doubler and the spacer in place. I've put one of the doublers in place. The bolt threads into the cross frame mounts. Both of these are going to do that in the front and the back. It's going to thread into the frame mount that we didn't tighten earlier. As such, you take the strut and you push the pin into the upper hole, and then you take the spacer and it's going to go between here, and then this bolt is going to thread into the spacer. You're going to do the same thing on both sides of the chassis. Okay, here you can see the rear struts in place, spacer in the center. There's 4mm bolts that went in this way into the spacer, 3mm bolts that connected the doublers to the frame spacer. Before you tighten those, you want to tighten the 2 bottom frame spacer plates so that flattens the spacer against the bottom plate, then the 2 3mm. You want to have used thread lock on all of these parts, blue thread lock. At that point the rear struts are in place. Now we'll move to the front. The front assembly is going to be exactly the same. The only difference is the frame doubler has a different shape. Once again, it's got a hole for an M3 bolt. That bolt's going to go into the front frame spacer on the lower motor plate, and the doubler is going to be positioned there on both sides, and then the struts will attach using a spacer in the center, just as we did in the back. And here's the struts assembled on the front of the chassis. Works the same way. There's a 4mm spacer between the 2. You put doublers on each side with 3mm bolts that thread into the frame spacers on the lower motor plate. Once you get those bolts in, you tighten the 2 3mm socket heads on the bottom of the cross frame plate. Then you can tighten the 4mm bolts that go through the struts into the spacer in the center, and then finally the M3 bolts that thread into the lower frame plate. You want to make sure you've got thread lock on all of these. Once all the struts are installed, we can install the skid tubes. There's two of them. The angle side goes forward. They will just slip right through the struts. This all aligns really well, so it won't be a problem. You want to leave about 25 millimeters of skid protruding in the back. That's about the right position. Okay, get that straight. Then you tighten the set screws on the inside of the struts until it clamps on the tube. If for some reason those set screws don't fit snugly, you want to remove each one and put some slow CA on them before you put them back in. Otherwise, these things can vibrate loose and then the skids will turn in flight. You want to do the same thing on the other side of the model, and then we'll have the skids on. Now we got both skids in, they're lined up, they're tight. We're going to go ahead and put the fuel tank in the next step.